Hi everyone and welcome. We've got quite a few people coming in today. Feel free to jump on the chat and say hi to us. My name's Susan Wilkin. I'm the training coordinator at Plum Solutions, and today we normally have a special guest planned, but today our guest is Danielle Stein Fairhurst, our principal of Plum Solutions and our head financial modeler, of course. And today you've got an amazing webinar planned all about budgeting and forecasting in Excel, and we're really looking forward to this. It's going to be an action-packed webinar. I know you've actually been working on this one for the last couple of days, preparing it. It's a big one that you've got planned, and we're really looking forward to it.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, I have. This is something that I've been running budgeting and forecasting training for years and years, and yet I still come up with new content all the time. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of that with you. Was there any housekeeping things you'd like to cover before we get started?
Yes, that would be amazing. So just a couple of things. If you reply in the chat at all, just make it all panelists and attendees so everybody can see your comments. That way we can all have a chat together. We do have a lot of people coming onto this webinar, so say hi, tell us where you're from. We look forward to hearing it. And especially since we aren't traveling at the moment, because this time last year, Danielle and I were actually in Dubai together on this exact date. So I've actually had a few of those memories come up just recently of our trip. So it's been nice to actually revisit those. I can't believe it's been a year either. So
no more travel. I think that was the last time. No, I did go to Dubai since then, but
you did.
It's been a long time since I went anywhere.
It has been a long time. So, and I've just seen Linda's come up from Essendon and Victoria, and it's nice to see that you're off lockdown now. Linda, I bet you're enjoying that.
Okay. All right. Well, we might get started, Susan. I'll get you to monitor the chat and the questions. So if you have just say hi in the chat, but the Q&A is where we're really going to tackle if there's any sort of curly questions that you want covered. And I'll stop every now and then, and Susan will jump in if there's any particular questions that people want to go through. So yeah, let's get started. So this is me. So this was the photo that Susan took when we were in Dubai together, and she's very kindly done a bit of photoshopping on it. I think she says she hasn't, but yeah, I think she might have done. So this is a little bit about me. So I'm a financial modeler first and foremost. I've been building financial models in Excel for many years. But the majority of the financial modelling that I do, or quite a bit of the modelling I do, is for the purpose of building budgets and forecasts. And it's a topic that's very close to my heart. So I'd like to sort of take you through some of the tools and techniques that we use for building budgets and forecasts in Excel, of course. So the reason for today is that we have a brand new online course coming up next month. So that's what I'll be taking you through is some, this is going to be a bit of a pre-course or a preview of what we'll be covering on the course, but it's also going to form basically the pre-course prerequisites for coming on the course. So we're going to cover, I'm going to give you a bit of a snapshot overview of some of the topics that we're going to be covering in that course. So it's going to be like this. It's a webinar style course, except that it's in a Zoom meeting, and it's a small group, and we'll be able to say hi and chat and ask all sorts of questions. So you can see me clutching my book there, and that book, as well as the Financial Modelling for Dummies. So I've written 2 books about financial modelling. We actually use that as a resource as part of the course, and so that's an option. So you can either buy the course by itself, or you can get it together with the book. So it's up to you. It's not required that you use the book, but it is kind of a useful companion. So before we jump in, I just wanted to do, firstly, just a little bit of just a check-in on budgeting and forecasting, because I know that we sometimes kind of use the words interchangeably, and some people think that they're kind of the same thing, but not really. And I just thought I'd start out by defining the difference between budgets and forecast, because basically a budget is a budget is a budget is a budget does not change. The budget is set for 12 months and it doesn't change. even when things completely go totally haywire like they have over the last 12 months. A forecast is updated continually. So a budget and a forecast are not the same thing. A budget is set and it doesn't change. A forecast is changing and it's dynamic, it's flexible. So the idea really is that a budget should be, is going to be less accurate because it's set well in advance, and it's usually a lot more detailed than a forecast. So that's kind of the difference. We'll be talking about sort of both of those really. What I wanted to do with you today is to really talk about I suppose the pandemic, but to talk about some of the things that we'll be covering in the course, but in relation to basically 4 different lessons from the pandemic. So these are the 4 sort of topics that I'll be going over. So firstly, one of the lessons that we have learned from the pandemic is that budgets need to be flexible and dynamic, and a really great way of doing that is using Excel. So we'll start out by talking about Excel. We cannot do incremental budgeting anymore. So we cannot just say, okay, well, this happened last year, so we'll roll it forward and do that again this year and just add 5% or 10% or whatever. That doesn't work anymore. So we'll be looking at a couple of options for that. We'll talk a little bit about seasonality and phasing. So historical data, we cannot really use that. That's pretty much all we can use historicals for at the moment, is to use it for seasonality, to get an idea of the fluctuations in the seasons. And lastly, we'll talk about accountability and the reason that we do budgets and whether we should rethink that. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is basically Excel. So the idea that budgets need to be flexible and dynamic, and a great way to do that is using Excel. Excel is what we know and love. I know many people would like to say that Excel is dead and that Excel is no longer being used for budgeting and forecasting. I still think that it's one of the best things that you can do for your career is to improve your Excel skills. So I'd like to sort of get a bit of a feel for those of you who are on the call today to find out how much do you actually use Excel during the budgeting and forecasting process in your organization. And I can see we've got quite a few varying responses already. I'd like to know whether you just use standard Excel, whether you use Excel as well as Power Query and Power BI. For those of you who were on the webinar a few weeks ago, we ran one on dashboards in modern Excel, so talking about Power Query and Power BI as well as standard Excel, and certainly that can be used for budgeting and forecasting and data analysis. Whether you use a combination of Excel as well as other systems, whether you don't use Excel at all, or whether you just don't do budgeting and forecasting. But I presume that you will be in the future, which is why you're here today. So I'm going to just end the poll and then share the results with you. And it looks as if most people only use standard Excel formulas. I'm surprised that there's such a large number of people only using Excel. I guess it's not surprising. I mean, Excel is certainly one of the most popular pieces of software, certainly in accounting and finance. But in my experience, I thought there's still quite a lot of people that do use both, that use a combination of Excel as well as other budgeting systems as well. But it does look as if most people are just using standard Excel formulas for their budgeting and forecasting. So that's quite interesting. I'm going to take you through a couple of examples today, just some quick demos, that's some tools and techniques that you can use in Excel, just using standard Excel, nothing fancy, no add-ins, and we'll jump into that in a minute. But firstly, I can see there's a few questions and some comments there. Yeah, I'll just check in with you, Susan. Is everything all right? Any questions from anyone? I can see there's a question from Christine about incremental budgeting. I will get into that. So Amin says granularity, what is a common theme and best practice for granularity? We will also get into that. So I might leave some of those. Was there any other questions, Susan, before we move on? Okay, all right, looks good. Okay, so let's get into incremental budgeting. So I hope that will answer your question, Christine. So the idea of not being able to do incremental budgeting, I mean, I'm not, Christine's asked whether it's not allowed. I suppose it is certainly allowed, but it's probably not such a great idea because everything this year has been quite crazy in terms of numbers. The fluctuations have been really all over the place. So you can, say, well, this is what happened last year, and so let's roll that forward. But it's really not a great idea because just because of the fluctuation. So that's why I say we can't really do incremental budgeting anymore. So let's have a look at some other options perhaps that are going to be better. One of the techniques I'd like to talk about is the concept of flex budgets. So you may or may not oh yes, I can see a comment here from Linda. Incremental budgeting has always been overused and was never a great idea as it was often lazy. That is very true, Linda. The idea of taking last year's budget and just rolling forward, it is laziness. But it's easy. We always try and take the easy way out, but it's not a great idea anymore. So getting into flex budgets, the idea of flex budgets is taking out the volume related variances, because when you're trying to analyze or you're trying to understand actual versus budget variance analysis, it's when when the volume is wrong, it's quite difficult to really get underneath the numbers, understand what's going on, because if the volumes are really crazy. So the idea of a flex budget is that you actually forecast what the budget would have looked like if you had gotten the volume right. So it strips out the variances that are relating to volume changes so that you can really get underneath and understand the underlying performance. So the idea is that you don't, you can really strip out volume related variances. So just to kind of demonstrate that, I might just show you an example in Excel, because the concept might be a bit tricky when I explain it, but if I show it, you might get it a bit better. I'm not going to, this is an exercise that we do on the full version of the course, but I'm just going to sort of do a truncated version for you. So here's an example, very simple example of the master budget here, and that's your actual there. So the variances, so we had a really bad year. We budgeted to make to produce or to sell 120 units. We only sold 80, and so the variance, it's a negative variance. And so you can see the sales were way under, the variables were way over, and the profit was way under, and yeah, so it's quite hard to see what's going on there. But if I actually do a flex budget here and then compare that to my actuals, I'll get a much better idea of what's actually going on, and I'll actually share this file with you, so you'll be able to get in and see the formulas, how it's been calculated. But if I just copy that across, you can see that there, and then I might just grab these formulas here, and you can see that I've if you've certainly if you've done my dashboards and modern Excel course, you'll know how to do a icon set. So we've just done some crosses and minuses, and there's some little formulas behind that there. So basically what we're saying is that if it's worse than budget, it's a cross. If it's on budget, it's a tick. And if it's greater or better than budget, it's a caution. So it's not necessarily a good thing if we are better than budget, basically, is what that's saying. So the idea here is that you can see, okay, that's good, that's good, that's good, that's good, that's good. This is where we really need to focus on. So the idea of a flex budget is that it strips out the volume related variances so that you can really see and focus on the variances that you really need to cover. Okay, so that's flex budgets. Was there any other questions or comments on flex budgets before I move on? I think we're all okay. All right. So let's look at another technique. Really, budgets should start from scratch. So we should just start completely fresh every single year and say, okay, this is completely from scratch. And we definitely need to do that after, in a post-COVID world. We need to say we can't look at what happened last year. We need to absolutely start from scratch. So the idea with that is zero-based budgeting, because we really just can't use last year's actuals to set the budget. So there's no reason to believe that what happened last year is going to happen again. So past events should not automatically be seen as a target. So using zero-based budgeting is going to be a lot better in a post-COVID world, absolutely. So with if you're going to apply zero-based budgeting, the budget for every single cost item is initially set to zero. And so every single time you want to do something, you need to justify it in terms of its continued usefulness. So it's kind of threatening. It is quite a scary idea, is to be using zero-based budgeting, because you basically start with absolutely no budget whatsoever. So every year you have to say, well, why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? You know, what do you do here anyway? Why are you even here? So it's a little bit of a scary thing to undertake. And the disadvantages of that is that it is quite time consuming and expensive to do. Managers can be can feel rather threatened or insecure. In my opinion, it is quite good for discretionary areas of expense like training and research, and it certainly should be used with sensitivity. So I'd like to get an idea from those of you who are live with me today, whether you've actually ever used zero-based budgeting. I'd like to sort of get an idea of whether people have used it before. Maybe they've never heard of it until today, or they've heard of it and don't think it's useful, or whether they use it regularly, use it all the time. So it's quite kind of interesting to see who's there. While we do that, I'll just check the messages and see if there's anybody. There's a couple of questions. Neil says a good 12-month rolling forecast process can automatically become the budget every year. Yes, it can. Yep. What is the efficiency of the zero-based budgeting model? It was a disaster that it was dropped off. Yes. Doing it across an entire organisation would be quite tricky. I think it's useful when it's done for certain line items. Okay, so I'm just going to share the results of that, and we can see that most people use it every now and then. Okay, that's quite interesting. All right. Okay. So just a couple of some techniques that you might consider rather than incremental budgeting. What I'd like to jump in. So Henry says zero-based budgeting is more consistent with bottom-up. Yes. Can zero-based budgeting be used on top-down budgeting approach? Yeah, so Henry's talking about whether we do top-down budgeting or bottom-up budgeting. So do we give the budget to everyone and say fill it in from bottom up, or whether we say here's your budget and you need to stick to it? So either of those. Generally, zero-based budgeting is bottom-up. Yes, you're right. It is quite hard to do both. Sometimes we say here's your target and bottom up from there and start from zero. So it is possible to use both of those. Thanks, Henry. Yeah, so let's jump into a little bit about seasonality now. So seasonality is so looking at historicals now. We really can only do that to understand what the seasonality is that's happening in the organizations now. And really, and this is very, very industry specific. There are some organizations that don't have seasonality at all. And a lot, but a lot do. So I think it really depends on the industry as well as on the organisation. So I'm just going to jump into Excel now and just show you a couple of examples of how we can use Excel to calculate some phasing and seasonality in forecast models. Okay. So here's an example of some phasing, just a really simple example here. So what I mean by phasing or seasonality is we often do it like this, where we say 0.8 means that it's lower than average. So 1 would be an average, and we'd say 80% or 0.8, and then we use that as a calculation going forward. So that's what I mean by phasing. Let's talk now a little bit about some forecasting. Excel's got some pretty easy and simple ways of doing some forecasting. I'm just going to jump in. I do like to always look at some data visually. For those of you who are doing my dashboards course, the visuals on this are pretty horrible. So Excel does like to do this kind of angled thing. So I always like to bring it out a little bit. That looks so much better. And for goodness sake, we change the colours. We don't just go with the standard colours. We make it look a little more interesting. Okay, so those are our sales going forward. Now you could just go like this. You could grab some numbers and just drag it down, and that wouldn't be very clever. From a modelling perspective, it's not very smart to do that. So I'm going to use just a really simple forecast function to say X is the point on the x-axis, the known y, so that known y's are the historical points along the y-axis, and the known x's are the corresponding points there. And we do just need to put in some $signs F4 to anchor it. So I should be able to copy it down, and yeah, not very clever. So Excel's not very clever when it comes to stuff like that. Well, it is, but it's only just looking at the numbers that I've used, and it's going less than 0. So that really doesn't make sense to have sales that go less than 0. So a way you could do that is, you know, you could say if, you could put an if around it and say if the forecast is less than 0, make it 0. Otherwise, give me the forecast. But that's quite a long, complicated formula. So a much more elegant way to do that would perhaps be to say max. So it'll just basically take the maximum value between the forecast and a 0. So when it gets to 0, it'll basically stop there. Because I often find that happens, certainly when you're doing sales, it doesn't, we often have to do a max around it like that. I'm just going to jump over to another similar example here. So, so here's one I'll show you. If I were to, this is one of the new features that came out using the forecast sheet, which is quite nice. It actually puts in the seasonality, because if I were to do it this way, it doesn't really use seasonality. It basically just it basically forecasts along a linear trend. Whereas if I were to go in and use forecast sheet and create, it actually uses the seasonality. So I can actually use a different formula here. So if I set the date and then pick up the values, F4, and then pick up the date, that should give me a similar result. So if I just create the line chart again, it looks something like that. It's just a lot better than forecasting along the trend line. So the trend line is pretty much straight. So using the forecast.ets stands for exponential triple smoothing. So it looks at the seasonality underneath the numbers and uses that to project going forward. So I do find that formula quite useful when you have some historical data. It only works really, you do need to have sort of 6 months worth of actuals in order to do that. And because and what I found, you know, I was with some clients last week and discovered that, you know, the numbers were just so crazy around sort of March and April, because it was retail and people there's a huge amount of purchase going on. People were stockpiling in March, and then the numbers kind of dropped off in April. And so we really had to get underneath and take out some of that fluctuations before we could then use any sort of forecasting to go forward. So, okay. So just jumping back here Did we have any, Susan, was there any questions? So Henry says, but the Excel forecast function is mainly about extrapolating from the past. Yes, that is true. We're not supposed to base forecast on history. Yeah, yeah, that's true. It does use the past, but you just need to it's really the seasonality that you're trying to sort of get out of that number. Any other sort of questions or comments here?
No, I think we're reasonably good, Danielle.
Oh, good.
I've sort of been running through everything for you.
Great. Okay. So yeah, one of the things that, you know, we're always talking about time series. In most financial models, it's always time series based. There is always some element of time. And certainly with budgeting and forecasting, you always have some sort of time series. And it's really important when you have a look at the data and to look at the trends is to try to sort of distinguish what type of trend it might be. So whether it is just a trend, so it's a general upward or downward movement, whether it's seasonality, whether it's cycles that occur every several years, or whether it's just a random variation, a blip caused by chance, or, you know, some like unexpected event like a global pandemic or something like that. So one of the techniques that we really like to use is a rolling forecast. So rolling forecasts have been sort of touted as the saviour of the COVID world, and many clients are asking for rolling forecasts, and they certainly are a lot easier than to do nowadays than they used to be. The advantage of using a rolling what I mean by a rolling forecast is that you have usually 12 months or maybe 18 months where you're forecasting out into the future based on the budget perhaps, and you might also, yeah. So with the rolling forecast is you're looking at 12 months, and then when the actual drops in, you then roll out for another 12 months, and then the next actual comes in and you roll out for another 12 months after that, or another month, so that you're always looking 12 months out into the future. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. But the advantage of using a rolling forecast is that it's continuous, that you're constantly reviewing, and it does encourage you to have a driver-based thinking, that you're constantly trying to understand the drivers underneath the model and what actually drives the organisation. Another thing that's good about them is that they're quick to respond and adapt, so you can very quickly see at 12 months forward going out into the future. And lastly, we have the capability, so we can and just there are systems that will do it for you, and it is as we've had a look at some of the formulas, some of the simple formulas that we've used, it is relatively straightforward to build one in Excel. So let's have a quick look at an example. Here's an example of one of the exercises that we do on the course. Now, I'm not going to put you into breakout groups. We've got like 125 people live right now, so it's far too many to pop you into breakout groups right now. But on the course, we put everybody into small groups and we sort of jump in and out of the groups. We do sort of 5 minutes demo, and then you do 5 minutes calculating it by yourself, and then we kind of come back together and we kind of do it together. So it's almost like being face-to-face. Not quite, but I can see your screen and you can see my screen, and it's kind of works like that. So these are the sort of instructions and examples that we work on during the course. So let me just show you a completed version of this. So this is the one that we do. So basically we've got some nice little, if I make this a little bit bigger, we've got some nice little spark lines here. So spark lines are a great way of showing sort of trends out for 12 months. So that is the budget here. These are the actuals, and this is going to be the actual and the forecast. So it's just some formulas that pick up whether it's the actual or whether it's the budget. And then once the actuals drop in, then we use then we have a forecast that rolls forward for 12 months. And I'm sure you're familiar with that formula. So that's a forecast.ets, and then we use the max, and then we use that forecast to roll it forward. And so then, of course, we have a lovely chart here that looks something like that. So you can kind of get an idea of as it overlaps, as things roll forward, so that you're always looking 12 months out into the future. So if you were to drop in something here and you were to say, let's say there was 100,000 in there, you can see that it'll actually adjust the forecast going forward, because that's an actual, and it'll adjust everything like that. So that's an example of how you might do a rolling forecast in Excel, so something like that. So lastly, let's talk about accountability. So one of the real reasons that we build budgets is for accountability. That's really the reason for it. And for that reason, I think that budgets do sometimes have a bit of an image problem. I know. I think budgets are fabulous. I think budgets are the bee's knees, but not everybody thinks that. And I spent many years being the budget person in my organisation, and people would run when they saw me coming. And because we often hear this kind of language, you know, you can't do that because it's not in the budget. So there's lots of reasons why budgets have an image problem, or why we don't like, or people don't like doing budgets. So this comes from Andy Shambrook from the Finance Business Partner. Just because it's in the budget doesn't mean that we should do it, which is very wise words. We often say, well, hey, we've got this budget allocated, we really should spend it. But by the same token, if it's not in the budget, doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. So it's really about the way that you, or the mentality of the culture of how budgets work in the organisation. And this one's also from Andy, so shout out to Andy, thank you for that, because we often see that when the new budget year starts, well, hey, we have so much money. Or similarly, you might also find that we have the June spending spree. There's all sorts of games that people play, and this also gives budgeting a bad name. So in Australia, we have the June year end. So the end of June is the end of the financial year. But if you have a December year end or an April year end, it's the same sort of thing, is that we're getting to the end of the budget year, and so therefore we have to spend all of the money because we have a use it or lose it kind of system in the organisation. There's padding, you know, there's all sorts of reasons why all these games that people play, because they're going to get measured against their budget. So the reason that we budget is to allocate resources, to measure and reward, and also as a system of control. And often those things people don't like being controlled or being told what to do. So I suppose that's why they have a bit of an image problem. And so you know, I sometimes see this as kind of an analogy for what management reporting does, because often we spend a huge amount of time putting together our budgets and our forecasts, and they sit on the shelf and don't get used. And so I think that management reporting is a really, really important part of the budgeting and forecasting process, absolutely. Because there's really no point in having a budget if you're not going to measure against it, because what gets managed, what gets measured, gets done, is very, very true. And it is important, though, particularly in the current environment, that we focus less on the numbers, because I really think that you couldn't blame a manager. So often what we find is that the budget is used as a target, and people's bonuses are being measured against their budget. So if you make your budget, then you get your bonus. And I think that probably is not a great way to manage at the moment, to focus less on the numbers, but really to still use it as a basis of control, and to check for measurement, but to focus less on making the numbers, because at the moment they are pretty much less meaningful than they normally would be. So I can see a question from Shanaz. Could you please provide the Excel sheet? Yes, I will be sending out. So for everyone who has registered for this, I will send out a copy. So that is pretty much what I have for you today. So please let me know if you have some questions. I'll stick around at the end if there's any particular questions you'd like me to jump into. Otherwise, I will continue. So the lessons from the pandemic, the things that we've talked about today, is that budgets do need to be flexible and dynamic, absolutely, and they always needed to be flexible and dynamic, but there's certainly at the moment it's never been more important to have flexible and dynamic budgets and forecasts. Using Excel, I think, is probably the quickest and the easiest way to do that. There's certainly other systems that are going to be so much better than Excel. However, Excel is what we know and love, and it's what people use in the organisation. In my opinion, one of the best things you can do for your career is have really good Excel skills when you're going for an interview, to say, hey, you know, I know how to use Power Query. I know how to, you know, I can build fantastic budgets in Excel. I can build a rolling forecast in Excel. It's just a fantastic skill to have. You cannot just say this is what happened last year and then roll that forward. It is just simply not an option anymore. So there are other tools that you can use instead. Using seasonality, we should certainly still be using seasonality for forecasting, but other than that, we should not be using historicals. It's going to be a little bit more work than it used to, but think about all the fantastic budgeting and forecasting skills you're going to get and all the experience you're going to get from building a really good budget and forecast this year. And lastly, thinking about accountability. Making sure that the budget is useful, that it is with measuring your variances, that it's actually something that provides a basis of control for the organisation. So before we finish up, are there any other questions or things that we should cover? Neil says, what are your views on dynamic arrays and budgeting? What about budgeting and Power Query? Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Neil. I thought nobody would ask about the new features of Excel. I'm a huge fan of using Power Query, dynamic arrays. Yes, any of the tools that are available to you, you certainly should be using. If you've been using Excel for a long time, as I have, it's sometimes tempting to use the old features of Excel rather than the new ones. So do try to expose yourself to dynamic arrays, to Power Query, to Power BI, to use all of those things for budgeting. They're certainly tools that are going to be useful for you. Probably more, Power Query is probably more for data analysis, for like looking at actuals. So the work I've been doing lately with the client, we actually use Power Query for hooking into the system, pulling it down and then populating the actual. So we just use Power Query for that. And dynamic arrays. I mean, dynamic arrays is part of Excel, so we certainly use that as well. Okay. So this is the course that we've got coming up. So it's coming up on the 2nd to the 4th of December. It's 3 hours every day. It's going to be Sydney time. So these are this is the agenda that we go through. It's Sydney time 3 to 6 p.m, which I think is the best for most people, depending on where you are in the world. There are some people who sign up and then just listen to the recordings if they can't make the live sessions. All of the sessions are recorded, and you do get 12 months access to those recordings. And I think we're actually going to make it possible to download the recordings as well. Yeah, how did I go, Susan? Did I miss anything about the course?
No, you did great. Other than the fact that we have a lot of fun on these courses as well. So
yes, so Susan will be there, and
I'll be there. I love these ones. So we have a lot of fun over the 3 days for the online and live workshops. So really looking forward to it.
All right. Thanks, Susan. So we might finish that up there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just make sure I haven't missed anyone or anything. I think we're all good. So thank you so much for attending today. We've got a bit of a break next week, and the week after that we have another fantastic session on virtual meetups for you. So